General Hospital teaser Professor Halton, with his cunning nature and sharp intellect, had long since figured out every scheme Josslyn had woven to undermine Emma. He was fully aware that Josslyn had stolen and sabotaged Emma's files, but more importantly, he understood the motives behind her actions. Despite knowing the truth, Halton chose not to expose it immediately. Instead, he made a deliberate decision to select Josslyn as his research assistant. A decision that, to her, seemed like a significant opportunity. Halton knew exactly what he was doing. Josslyn, driven by ambition and a lack of caution, was the perfect pawn in his long-term plans, and she had no idea just how deeply entangled she was in his designs. Josslyn, after completing the task assigned to her by the WSB, believed she was on the right path. She thought that damaging Emma's files was a part of her own strategy to achieve her objectives. In her mind, she was executing a clever move, advancing herself in the ranks and getting closer to her goals. However, the reality was far from what she imagined. Unbeknownst to her, Josslyn had fallen into a trap that was far larger than she could comprehend. She was not the one in control. Instead, she was merely the prey in a high-stakes game of power that Halton had already orchestrated. In his eyes, Josslyn was nothing more than a piece on a chessboard, and the task she thought she had completed successfully was only the first step in a much bigger plan he had quietly prepared. Halton had carefully crafted every move, knowing that Josslyn's ambition and lack of foresight would make her the ideal tool for his own ends. As she thought she was gaining ground, she was unknowingly being manipulated into playing her part in a game that could destroy her before she even realized what was happening. Her every action was being monitored, every decision calculated, and every mistake would eventually lead her deeper into the snare he had set. Josslyn had no idea that the path she believed she was carving for herself was, in reality, the one Halton had planned for her all along. Meanwhile, Emma, ever observant and dedicated, began to sense that something was amiss in the world around her. After weeks of tireless work and dedication, she had successfully completed an important research project, a program she had poured her heart and soul into. She had worked late nights, sacrificing time with her friends and family, determined to submit the program on time and impress her mentors, especially Professor Dalton. But soon, an unsettling feeling began to gnaw at her. As she reviewed her files and notes one final time before submission, Emma discovered discrepancies, anomalies she could not explain. It was as if someone, had tampered with her hard work. Her sense of unease grew with each passing day. At first, she thought it could be a simple mistake, a misunderstanding. But the more she dug, the clearer it became that this was not an accident. Key pieces of her research had been altered, data was missing or corrupted, and some of her most critical findings were inexplicably altered in a way that seemed deliberate. Emma's mind raced as she retraced her steps, but no matter how much she tried to make sense of it, the pieces didn't fit. As Emma pondered the situation, a nagging suspicion started to take root in her mind. It didn't take long for her to connect the dots. She had always trusted Josslyn, even considered her a friend, but now, after everything she had observed, it was impossible for Emma to ignore the signs. It was Josslyn who had been near her things when Emma wasn't around. It was Josslyn who had access to the same data and had been working on similar projects. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together in a way that was hard for Emma to deny. Josslyn was behind the sabotage. Despite her suspicions, Emma found herself in a precarious position. She had no concrete evidence, no undeniable proof that Josslyn had deliberately tampered with her research. What she did have were gut instincts, subtle signs, and a growing sense of dread. Emma's mind raced as she considered her next steps. If she confronted Josslyn without evidence, she risked ruining their relationship and making accusations that could backfire. Yet, the longer she waited, the more the fear of being manipulated and betrayed tightened its grip on her. The worry grew even more intense as Emma realized the potential consequences. If her work was compromised in this way, it could cost her the internship, her reputation, and everything she had worked for. But worse than the professional setback was the emotional betrayal. Josslyn had been someone she trusted, and now Emma was faced with the possibility that her friend, or at least someone she had considered a friend, had played a role in sabotaging her. The uncertainty was maddening, and the longer she lived with it, the more it weighed on her mind. Unable to ignore the mounting pressure, Emma found herself caught in a dangerous game. On one hand, she felt she had to expose the truth, but on the other, she feared that doing so without solid proof would only make her look paranoid and unjust. She was trapped in a web of suspicion and doubt, with no clear way out. Josslyn, though increasingly unsettled by the mounting suspicion around her actions, remained determined to continue playing her part in the complex web she had inadvertently stepped into. The reality of what she had done, of the lines she had crossed, lingered in her mind like a shadow, but her ambition and desire to prove herself kept her moving forward. Each day, as she worked in Halton's research lab, she continued to believe she was fulfilling a critical role, unaware of the deeper and darker layers of the situation she was now entangled in. There were moments when doubt crept in, when she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her uneasy conscience, the whispers of guilt that occasionally surfaced, made her question the true nature of her involvement in the tasks Halton had assigned to her. She found herself thinking back to the day she had been tasked with tampering with Emma's research, how easily she had justified it, how little she had considered the consequences. Josslyn had thought she was simply helping her own career, furthering her position within the organization, but now, with everything in motion, she wondered if she had made a fatal mistake. The fear of being caught, the fear of facing the repercussions, gnawed at her, but the pull of her ambitions kept her going. Little did Josslyn know, she was no longer just a player in the game, she had become one of the pieces, manipulated by forces far beyond her understanding. Every move she made, every decision she thought was hers, was being carefully monitored and orchestrated by Halton. He had planned this all along, using her as a tool, a pawn in a much larger, far-reaching strategy. While Josslyn carried on with her tasks, convinced she was in control of her own fate, Halton watched from the shadows, a master of manipulation, pulling strings without ever revealing his hand. Halton's presence, though never overtly felt, was always there. Looming behind the scenes, his calculating eyes watching every detail unfold. He had orchestrated every step, carefully setting the pieces in place to ensure that Josslyn would unknowingly play her part in the grand scheme. His influence was subtle but potent, and as Josslyn went about her work, believing she was advancing in her own right, Halton silently controlled the narrative. She remained unaware that every success, every step forward, was simply part of his design. From his vantage point, Halton saw the bigger picture. He wasn't just monitoring Josslyn's every move, he was also watching Emma, assessing the risks and opportunities that each of them presented. While Josslyn believed she was climbing the ladder, Halton knew exactly where she stood, right where he wanted her to be. He didn't need to rush, didn't need to force anything. Patience was his greatest weapon, and he had all the time in the world to execute his plans to perfection. Josslyn, for her part, remained oblivious to the fact that she had become a tool in someone else's game, a mere pawn in a battle she didn't even understand. She couldn't see that her every move was being controlled by someone with far more experience, far more knowledge of the stakes involved. As she carried on, thinking she was making decisions for her future, Halton was quietly tightening his grip, ensuring that she remained in the dark, unaware of the trap that was slowly closing around her. Ultimately, the relationships between Emma, Josslyn, and Halton were all built upon a foundation of lies and deception, each one intertwined in a complex web of manipulation, secrecy, and betrayal. Emma, despite her strong moral compass and deep desire to avoid escalating the situation, began to realize that something far darker was unfolding around her. For weeks, she had tried to maintain the status quo, believing that the oddities she noticed were mere coincidences, but now, the pieces were falling into place. The nagging suspicion that something had gone terribly wrong with her research was only the tip of the iceberg. As she dug deeper into the situation, she began to see patterns in the chaos, patterns that pointed to someone deliberately pulling the strings behind the scenes. Emma wasn't a fool. She knew that Josslyn, despite her outward charm and friendly demeanor, had been involved in the sabotage of her work. But the more she tried to confront the truth, the more the shadows around the situation seemed to shift and blur. She couldn't pinpoint exactly who was orchestrating the entire affair. Was it just Josslyn, acting out of personal ambition and jealousy, or was there something more sinister at play? As Emma pieced together the evidence, one name kept creeping into her mind: Halton. But how could he be involved? Was it possible that the seemingly affable professor, whom Emma had trusted and looked up to, was the one pulling the strings? The realization was slow to hit her, but when it did, it shook her to the core. Emma couldn't decide whether to confront Josslyn, who, despite everything, remained her colleague, or to expose the whole conspiracy and risk her own career. The stakes were high, and Emma found herself caught between the need for justice and the fear of what would happen if she didn't play the game carefully. The deeper she dug, the more she realized how much bigger this situation was than just her and Josslyn. Someone had been manipulating them both, using them as pawns in a game that neither of them had fully understood. On the other hand, Josslyn remained blissfully unaware of the larger forces at play. While Emma was becoming more attuned to the intricate network of lies and deceit, Josslyn was still riding high on what she perceived as her growing success. She thought her actions, tampering with Emma's research and securing her position in Halton's lab, were signs of progress, proof that she was on the right path. What she didn't realize was that she had unknowingly stepped right into Halton's trap, a trap that had been laid out for her long before she ever considered crossing Emma. Josslyn was blind to the fact that Halton had orchestrated everything from the very beginning. The professor's manipulation was so subtle, so calculated, that Josslyn believed she was acting independently. She thought she had gained Halton's trust through her cunning and ambition, but in reality, she was nothing more than a tool in his larger scheme. Halton had carefully crafted every step of the process, ensuring that Josslyn's every move served his end goals. Whether she succeeded or failed, she was always playing a part in a much larger plan, a plan that she had no control over. What made the situation even more dangerous was that Josslyn believed she was in control of her own destiny. She thought she was climbing the ladder, advancing in her career, and outsmarting Emma along the way. But in truth, Halton had been pulling the strings all along, manipulating her every step to ensure that she would remain trapped in his web. Every success, every triumph Josslyn thought she had achieved, was merely part of the professor's carefully constructed illusion, designed to keep her moving forward while he worked quietly behind the scenes. For Emma, the stakes were now higher than ever. She knew she couldn't trust Josslyn, but she also knew that exposing the conspiracy would not be easy. The question remained. Could she gather enough evidence to prove that Halton was the one truly orchestrating everything, or would she be forced to play the game in the shadows, just as Josslyn had? As she grappled with the weight of her decisions, she realized that the lines between friend and foe had blurred beyond recognition. And for Josslyn, the more she believed in her own success, the closer she came to being completely consumed by Halton's manipulation. Both women, unknowingly entangled in his machinations, were headed toward a collision that would alter their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. As the labyrinth of lies and deceit continued to tighten around Emma and Josslyn, both women found themselves entangled in a game far more dangerous and complex than they could have ever imagined. For Emma, the painful realization that she was not only being betrayed by Josslyn, but perhaps also by the very person she had trusted, Halton, came as a crushing blow. Her instinct had always been to seek truth and justice, but in this twisted game, those virtues felt increasingly like weaknesses. Emma was now at a crossroads. She understood that the longer she hesitated, the more she would be drawn into the destructive undertow of the deception. If she exposed Halton's involvement without concrete proof, she risked not only her career but her credibility as well. Could she gather enough evidence to expose the mastermind behind it all? Or would she be forced to play the game herself, staying in the shadows, biding her time until she could find the right moment to strike? The internal conflict was tearing at Emma. On one hand, her conscience screamed for action. She had to do what was right and stop Josslyn before things spiraled out of control. On the other hand, the growing realization that Halton was manipulating both her and Josslyn was like a heavy weight on her chest. Emma had come to the painful understanding that in this game, there were no clear boundaries between friend and foe. Josslyn, once someone she had trusted, was now a mere pawn in a larger game, and Emma had no idea how far Halton's reach truly extended. Her every move had been calculated by someone more powerful, more experienced. The lines between right and wrong, friend and enemy, had blurred beyond recognition, leaving Emma with no clear path forward. For Josslyn, the slow realization that she was being used was equally devastating, though she was still blind to the full scope of Halton's manipulations. She had been operating under the illusion of control, believing that she was advancing her career and gaining the trust of Halton, all the while thinking she was outsmarting Emma. But the more she moved forward, the more the cracks in her confidence began to show. The guilt of her actions, especially with regard to Emma, began to eat away at her, but she was too entrenched in her own ambitions to stop. Her fear of being caught, the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right, grew louder every day, but Josslyn didn't yet see the trap she had walked into. She believed she was merely playing the game, taking the necessary steps to secure her place in the organization, but the truth was far darker than she realized. Every success, every small triumph she thought she had achieved, had been orchestrated by Halton from the very beginning. Halton, for his part, was a master of patience. His calm, calculating demeanor remained unchanged, even as the tension around him grew. He had been playing this game for much longer than anyone realized, setting his pieces in place with the precision of a seasoned strategist. He had known from the beginning how to manipulate both Josslyn and Emma, to use their strengths and weaknesses to his advantage. He had carefully crafted the illusion of success for Josslyn, just enough to keep her moving forward, thinking she was winning. And for Emma, he had created a web of confusion and doubt, knowing that the longer she was unsure of who was truly behind the plot, the less likely she would be to make a move. Halton had carefully calculated every detail, every interaction, every step in this elaborate game. But as the days passed and the tension mounted, it became clear that the truth would eventually come to light. Both Emma and Josslyn, though still unaware of the full extent of Halton's control over them, were beginning to question their positions. Emma, desperate to find clarity and justice, was nearing a breaking point. The walls around her seemed to close in with every passing day. She had to make a choice: stay silent, allow herself to be manipulated further, or take the risk of exposing everything, even if it meant losing everything she had worked for. The fear of being wrong, of making an accusation without proof, weighed heavily on her. But the possibility of living in a world of deceit, of knowing that Halton controlled every aspect of her life, was unbearable. Josslyn, too, stood at a precipice. She believed her success was her own doing, that she had earned every step of her advancement. But the doubt that had crept into her mind was becoming too loud to ignore. She could feel the weight of her actions catching up with her. The lies she had told, the research she had sabotaged, it was all starting to unravel. Yet she couldn't see the true enemy. She didn't realize that she wasn't the one in control, that Halton had been playing her from the start. The more she pushed forward, the closer she got to a confrontation with the truth, a truth that would shatter everything she believed about herself and the people around her. And Halton, ever the puppet master, continued to pull the strings from behind the scenes. His cold, calculated moves had placed Emma and Josslyn in a delicate dance, both of them unaware of the trap that was tightening around them. He had anticipated every move, every reaction. All he needed now was for the two women to make their final moves. Emma, though uncertain, would eventually take action, and Josslyn would either rise or fall depending on how well she could maintain her facade. Halton knew that no matter the outcome, he would emerge unscathed, for he had long since prepared for every eventuality. The clock was ticking, and the final moments of this game were approaching. Emma and Josslyn, caught in a struggle neither fully understood, were running out of time. The truth would soon be exposed, and only one question remained: who would emerge victorious when the game ended? Would Emma be able to reclaim control of her life, or would Josslyn be the one to fall into the abyss of Halton's designs? And what would be left of their friendship, their trust, once the truth finally came crashing down? In the end, the choices they made in the coming days would determine not just their futures, but the very fabric of their identities. The stakes had never been higher, and the consequences of their actions would echo long after the final move was made.